Okay, good evening, goeienaand almal. This is going to be a bit of a presentation on the budget of the presented this afternoon by the Minister of Finance. Now we're going to show you this presentation today. Now, it is this was quite a feat to get everything done. You will see this whole presentation. I just imagine how the Minister of Finance, how he really struggled to get his new budget together because they have to change all those documents. Anyway, you see a QR code in front of you. Scan that QR code, you will get the presentation there, you will get my newsletters there, you can get all sort of stuff of Efficient there. So just scan that. I'm just going to wait, say, another minute or two. If I can see there are more people coming in. Before we get to that, like I've said, this was quite a job to get everything done in time. And I must thank the team. We have at Efficient just the most amazing team. Thank you very much for everybody for what you've done. Put everything together. And again, scan this QR code. I think we will show the QR code a bit later, Francois. And then you can get an opportunity to scan it again. Also, at the bottom, you will see there are a Q&A little block. If there are any questions, just go in there. Francois will, after the presentation, he will give me some of the questions and I'll try to answer that if that is possible. Okay, if you've just tuned in, this is a presentation on the budget of the Minister of Finance. He delivered his budget this afternoon. It was the second try. Now, I've been analyzing the budgets for 40 years. My first one was in 1985. Baron du Plessis was still the Minister of Finance then. So for 40 years, I've been analyzing these budgets. I worked at the South African Reserve Bank. As a young economist, I analyzed the fiscal accounts. And we worked with Treasury at that time, and still the Reserve Bank and Treasury work together quite closely in order to prepare a budget like this. And since then, I've been analyzing the budget this is my 40th budget that I've analyzed. And it's the first time that the Minister of Finance actually postponed the budget speech. And so this is actually something really unusual. Again, take your phone, take a picture of this QR code. Let me see how we're doing, Francois. Can we get going? So I guess we can get going. Scan this QR code. I'll show it later again. And again, thank you very much for my team for everything that you've done. Let's get going. So what is going on in the world? This is the first step. Remember, my approach to this whole budget is that I try to get a bit of a broader picture of where we are in the world, what's going on in politics, because South Africa is a very small player in the rest of the world. And of course, the budget has to fit in with that, all of that. So let's just see what's going on in the world. And here are some major and very important trends that are going on in the world that we all have to be aware of. There are dramatic changes in terms of demographics globally. Populations are getting smaller in just about all the rich countries in the world. And not only rich countries, something new is that some poorer countries are also experiencing a decline in populations. Countries like, for example, Russia and China, on a per capita basis, they are still very poor and they are experiencing a fall in demographics, and that will have a profound effect on the world economies and those economies as well. AI, we know AI is all the rage at the moment, leading to amazing technological breakthroughs at all levels of the economy, or just about all levels of the economy. And another trend that has been happening, I'm going to show you a bit of a slide on that, is that the nature of economies are changing. Economies are becoming more service-orientated. The primary sectors in economy are becoming less important, while the service part, the tertiary part of the economy, that part that is actually technologically driven, that is becoming far more important. And in fact, even the primary companies or businesses like agriculture, for example, a lot of the actual value add happens in the tertiary part of the economy. This is just a graph on population growth globally. The rate of population growth is slowing down quite significantly. And I'm going to be a bit rude in this presentation. This presentation is very long. And I know if you do a presentation with slides, you're supposed to talk through all of the slides. There simply will not be enough time. Like I've said, there's a QR code. Take that QR code and you can go through it later in your own time. So I'm just putting most of these slides in. I'm not going to go through all of the slides because there's just a time problem that we have here. All right. Some of the benefits of artificial intelligence and some of the industries that will benefit from this. Like I've mentioned, the nature of economic activity have changed. That green part is actually the service part of the economy. Now, I couldn't get data going back further back, but if I'm not mistaken, if you go back, say 100 years or so back, the South African, the blue part, the bottom part, the primary part of the economy, that was approximately 80% of the economy consisting of mining and of agriculture. And today, as you can see, mining and agriculture is a significantly smaller part of the economy than what it used to be in the past. And the big part of the economy, the growth part of the economy, is the green part. That's the service part of the economy. And this is important to understand this. And this fits in with the budget because what we need to do, we have to prepare our population for that green part of the economy, the service part of the economy. And if you want to participate in that part of the economy, you must have some very special skills. Because economies are not primary anymore or even secondary. Economies are tertiary. And also another trend that's happening, people are moving to the cities. And that's also important. Of course, we have to look after the rural areas, but it makes much more sense to build a road that's going to be used by 1 million people than to build a road that's going to be used by 100 people because people are urbanizing. That is the reality of life. People are moving to the cities, and that's where the emphasis must be. We must develop our cities and of course rural parts as well. But there's this romantic idea about the rural of living somewhere in a small town. That's not the reality. The reality is people want to live in big cities. Again, I just want to remind you at the bottom you can get Q&A, and just if you have any questions, just pop the questions in there. About what I've just said just now, land doesn't matter. And this is why this whole political thing about land in South Africa, the expropriation bill as an example. And it's, by the way, the expropriation bill is not only about land, it's about all assets. So the state now is in a position and a better position to steal just about all assets if they want to. And on that point, what we must understand that the primary function of the state is to protect me and my asset, me and my stuff. And if the state now has got a tool available to politicians where they can steal more stuff. But the point I want to make, everybody is quite emotional about land for various reasons, but land doesn't matter. It's what you do with the land what really matters. I point to the previous graph where the tertiary part of the economy is becoming more and more important. The same goes for agriculture. If you want to be involved in agriculture, you must have the necessary skills. And it means any kind of skill because you can be anything and still work in agriculture, for example. And then that's what I've said about the technology. We have to understand that technology is important and we have to prepare our population for a technology advanced future. And of course, an economy that is exactly where the economic growth is taking place. A very good example is that the so-called digital nomads that are coming to South Africa, and when they come and work in South Africa, and it's very good for us because they spend their money here, and we must make it easier even for foreigners to come and work in South Africa and to go to our restaurants and enjoy our steak and brandy and coke. And of course, we have to make sure that they live in a safe environment, what they're certainly not doing at the moment. Well, no, very few South Africans, except for the politicians with their blue light brigades, but for the rest of us, it's quite a dangerous place to be. What we can also see globally is that there's a shift politically to the right, a significant shift, especially recently in Europe, what we've seen that. But what does it mean, a shift to the right? It means anti-woke. It means smaller governments. Unlike what we have in South Africa, we've got bigger and growing governments. It means more conservative. It means perhaps even more nationalism. That is, in fact, what we're seeing in Europe as well. More anti-immigration. And again, we see that everywhere. Trump is a good example of that. And one can ask the question, is this good or bad for the economy? But the important point to make is that governments and states have been getting bigger and bigger for many, many years. And they are, in many cases, just far too big. And they are the burden of these huge economies and states on the economy has reached such a point now where the economy simply cannot carry that anymore. And that's exactly where South Africa is. This is just a fun graph that we've decided to put together to look at the various political blocks internationally. On the left, we've got the West, and the size of the bubbles is more or less the same size of their economies. So you can see the West is by far the biggest block of economies out there. Although there's a question mark on whether Europe and the United States is actually still part of the same political bloc. The middle block there, that's the East. That's mostly China and Russia there. And then on the right, we've got BRICS. And it's quite clear that BRICS is a significant part of the world economy, but it's not a unified political bloc. And then between those two first bubbles, there's a tiny little bubble there, that is South Africa. In fact, we were quite good for South Africa there in making that bubble too big. That bubble should be much smaller. But if we made it the size, the actual size of the South African economy, you wouldn't have been able to see that. The point I want to make, South Africa represents less than 0.4% of the world economy. The US economy is 20% of the world economy. We are tiny. We are not negotiating on equal footing here. We are talking to the big bully. Whether you like the Americans or not, you better be on their good side because they are the biggest economy in the world. All right, so a couple of other trends that's happening globally. Inflation is coming down, although there could be a bit of an uptick in inflation, especially if things like tariffs are introduced in the United States. I still believe that there's room for interest rates to be lowered internationally, locally as well. Most of Europe, the major economy in the world, is growing very slowly, or some of them actually are in recession. The Chinese economy is also struggling a bit. But we expect still positive economic growth, but don't expect China to be that major economic driving force that's been driving the world economy forward anymore. And then the US economy just keeps on growing, although there are signs that the US economy is slowing down. Depending on what's going to happen in the Trump administration, they they keep on changing policies there, and they keep on changing presidential decrees all the time. But that can put upward pressure on inflation in the United States, and that can slow economic growth down in the US economy. Some analysts are predicting an actual recession in the US. I'm not there yet, but what is certainly clear is that we're talking about a slowdown in economic growth in the United States. Now, this is just some forecasts on economic growth and things like, for example, inflation and interest rates and so on. And again, I'm not going to go through all of that. I just want to make the important point that globally, the forecast for economic growth is about 3.3%. Next year, the same, 3.3%. Last year, economic growth was in excess of 3% globally. Some of the big economies, the Chinese economy is expected to grow at 4.5%. And this year, I don't believe that. I think it's going to be slower. European economic growth, just about nothing, 1% if they're lucky. The US economic growth, about 2% or so, and some other estimates as well. Now, the reason why I mention this is because, according to the Minister of Finance, the South African economy is going to grow at 1.9%. I doubt that. I don't think we're going to grow there. Now, we're talking about world economic growth in excess of 3%. We're not going to get to 1.5%, I believe. Last year, economic growth in South Africa, the world economy expanded at a rate of about 3.2%. The South African economy grew at a rate of 0.6%. The point I want to make, we are doing very, very badly when it comes to economic growth. Listening to the president, we are absolutely living in the most, I'm referring to the State of the Nation address. And just by the way, what was very, very interesting for me, a year ago, the DA was not very happy to applaud the president when whatever he said. We subsequently had an election, and now we have a government of national unity, or so-called government of national unity, and especially the DA, they were very enthusiastic, and they applauded the president whenever he said anything. Previously, they certainly would not have done that. But listening to the president, we are really living in the most amazing country. In fact, we are, but I mean, in terms of our achievements, and listening to the president, all the services that are being delivered, and how everything's going well, and how many people are getting electricity and water and this and that and the other. Of course, the president did not touch on those things where we are not doing that well. So the reality of the life that we are living in South Africa, and the kind of picture that the president is painting about what is actually happening in South Africa, those two are completely different, and I'm going to show you some numbers. This is a very important number. This is South Africa's per capita GDP compared to the rest of the world. Now, that solid line is the world's per capita GDP based in the index at 100, at the level of 100, and South Africa compared to the rest of the world. Now, if you go back to 1994, the average South African per capita GDP was roughly the same of that of the rest of the world. And today, the South African per capita GDP compared to the rest of the world is approximately 75% of world GDP. This is a horrible, horrible number. The world is getting richer. South Africa, relative to the rest of the world, is falling behind. This is our biggest challenge, to get the economy to grow and to grow the economy on a per capita GDP. This compared to the rest of the world. But if you compare South Africa to ourselves, this is South Africa's per capita GDP over time. South Africans today, on average, are poorer than more than 15 years ago. There's the South Africa per capita GDP over time. So we're losing compared to the rest of the world, but we're losing compared to ourselves as well, and we are getting poorer. Just a couple of other estimates. Now, the bottom line is Sub-Saharan Africa, the red line. So we've done many calculations. I'm just showing you some of those. Compare South Africa to the rest of the world. Compare South Africa to the rich world. You will see that in most cases we are falling behind in just about any possible economic metric or social metric for that matter. If you compare South Africa to poor regions of the world, and that's Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, they are catching up with us, and they're catching up with us quite rapidly. And this is what this one specific analysis shows, is that access to electricity, we are more or less in line with the rest of the world, but the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa is catching up with us very quickly. This is electricity generated in the world. Now, if you go back to 1985, on average, the electricity generated in South Africa was double that on the average electricity generated per capita in the world. And today, South Africa generates about the same as the world's per capita electricity generation. So in the relative terms, our electricity generation halved since 1985. How do we use electricity per GDP generated? And this is a bit of a silver lining, and we're getting better and better in using electricity. So we're using less electricity to generate the same GDP. Here is an interesting one. You can see that's the top line is South Africa's how much electricity we use to generate 1 unit of GDP or economic growth or economy, if you like. And it's that ratio is falling, which means we're using less electricity to generate the same GDP, but we're still not at the world's average, but we're making nice progress. This is South Africa's unemployment rate. Well, need I say more? Unemployment levels in South Africa are at absolute horrible levels. The reason for that is because the economy is not growing. This is another way of looking at the unemployment. I think this is a better way of looking at unemployment. There are 60%, look at the right hand, the top right hand, that's 60.2%. There are 60% of the population is available to work in the economy, but only 40.9% of that available population actually works in the economy. That is the so-called absorption rate. Compare that to where it was in 2014, for example, when the absorption rate was significantly higher. This is a better way of looking at unemployment. Life expectancy, and again, what we can see in South Africa, in the case of South Africa, life expectancy is more or less in line with the rest of Africa and is lower than the rest of the world. Fortunately, again, that is gradually going up a little bit. People using the internet, this is actually quite a good number. South Africa, more people on average are using the internet than most places in the world, certainly more than Sub-Saharan Africa, and we're even doing better than our average in the rest of the world, not a bad number. We send a lot of our kids to school, so South Africans do go to school more years than the rest of the world, but if you look at the quality of South Africa's education, that is actually very, very bad. So we have to use our years going to school better than what is currently the case. South Africa's literacy rate, that is also not too bad. But there are other ways. If you look at South Africa's primary education, for example, we are really doing quite badly. But literacy, simply looking at literacy rates, South Africa is actually comparing not too bad to the rest of the world. This is just a graph, and again, I'm not going to go through all of this. You can go through it in your own time if you want to. Just take a snapshot of that QR code, and you will see that the quality of South Africa's education, despite our relatively high levels of literacy, the quality of South Africa's education is really quite bad. Corruption perception, the perception out there of South Africans are that we are exceptionally corrupt in South Africa, and that hasn't changed. In fact, it's at the lowest it's ever been. And there are many other indices that suggest that the confidence in South Africa are actually quite low. Investor confidence and consumer confidence are very, very low. Crime in South Africa, well, need I say more? Here are some statistics on crime in South Africa, and this is absolutely horrible. Our crime rates are of the highest in the world. Homicide rates, you can look at that. That's the average, that's for South Africa, and at the bottom we've got Sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of the world. This is the murder capital of the world. Inflation in South Africa, the Reserve Bank has been doing an excellent job recently. The inflationary pressures that we do have in South Africa is mostly because of administrative prices, and that's mostly the state. I still believe there's room for a further cut in interest rates a little bit later this year. Politics, we've got a so-called government of national unity in South Africa. It's more coalition. The DA up to now was actually a very weak government of national unity partner or coalition partner, but suddenly the DA found their voices with the budget, and they opposed 3 weeks ago a 2 percentage point increase in value-added tax. I don't think the government of national unity will survive the full term. I think the DA, and it will be good advice for the DA to leave the government of national unity a year or so before the next general election, and to make sure that they establish their own brand separate from the ANC. The ANC actually took the DA for a ride recently, because the impression was created that the DA is in support of things like Bella and expropriation bill and all of that. It was with the budget, or the 3 weeks ago, when the DA actually showed their strength and opposed the 2 percentage point increase in the value-added tax. And suddenly, the DA found their voice again, and suddenly, there's the search for a DA amongst the electorate again. So some challenges locally. We've got a major challenge on the local authorities. The majority of them are financially in distress. I'm going to show you some numbers a little bit later. The same goes for the state-owned enterprises. I'm talking about Eskom and Transnet and the like. We spend far too much money on the social wage. And part of the reason for that has to do with high levels of poverty and unemployment. And a couple of other things. You can go through that as well. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I need to get to the rest of the budget. The municipalities are very important to business, because that is your most important authority. But in the meantime, more than 70% of the local authorities got qualified audits. And currently, the outstanding debt of the local authorities to Eskom is approximately 110 billion rand. And this number was not included in the Minister of Finance's estimates. And he should have actually included in his own estimate of debt going forward. And that's why I do not believe the debt estimates of the minister going forward. I'll get to that a little bit later. I think we actually have an opportunity to get economic growth much stronger now. We can get economic growth to 3% or even higher. We need to do a couple of things. We have to get rid of Gwede Mantashe. He's a major obstacle to mining in South Africa, without a doubt. The new electronic system is likely to support economic growth a little bit. We have an opportunity with the G20 this year to really to use South Africa, to showcase South Africa. Unfortunately, Johannesburg is falling apart, so it will be better to rather move everything down to Cape Town, where their DA is in charge. Not that I'm a great fan of the DA. And maybe just an opportunity here with Donald Trump as well. And for the ANC. If we go back to Donald Trump and tell him we're going to get rid of expropriation, we will make sure that we put a lot of politicians in jail, so implement the Zondo Commission, for example, and cut all ties with Iran, for example, and tell him we are very, very sorry and stand on our knees. I think there's a good possibility that we can see substantial capital inflows coming from the United States, investment in South Africa, and pushing South Africa's economic growth up to much higher levels. The point is, do not mess with Donald Trump. He's the most powerful guy in the world, with the biggest economy, the biggest military behind him. And if you step on his toes, He's not going to take that lightly. This is just the state-owned enterprises, how much money we've been wasted on state-owned enterprises for many, many, many years. Many, many billions of rands, and they need more money. This is an example of the mismanagement of the ANC for many, many years. It's not only the debt, I'm going to show you the debt, outstanding debt, but it's also the guarantees. There are implicit and explicit debt that the Minister of Finance must include in his outstanding debt estimates as well, and he doesn't do that. For example, there's something like 800 billion rand approved guarantees to the state-owned enterprises, which is not included in the debt levels of the Minister of Finance. Okay, so what's going on in the economy? The economy is not growing. We've got very high debt, rather tax burden on the economy. We cannot increase taxes further. We are over the so-called Laffer curve. The tax base is exceptionally narrow. Very few people pay just about all the taxes in the economy. We've got a lot of social demand on spending. Huge demand on the Minister of Finance to spend more and more money. In the meantime, the state is destroying capital. The state-owned enterprises have all but collapsed. The same goes for the local authorities, and the debt trajectory is unsustainable. That is the reality. That's what we are facing now. This is just a summary on state expenditure, the top line relative to the size of the economy, the line there, the red line there, after that is those are just estimates going forward, and the bottom line, the blue line, that is state revenue as a percentage of GDP. And as you can see, the gap between the two is a so-called fiscal deficit, and that is currently standing at approximately 5% of GDP, which is far too big. We need to bring the fiscal deficit down, and the only way to that we can do that is to spend less money, but we haven't seen that in the budget really. These are the estimates of the Minister of Finance. Let's look at that 25-26 column there. So the Minister of Finance is expecting a total revenue of 2.2 trillion rand, which is 27-28% of GDP. I don't think that will realize. I don't think that the economy will grow so fast as he is expecting, and I think that the total revenue will remain under pressure in the coming financial year as well. Expenditure, now look at the expenditure number. The Minister of Finance, relative to the size of the economy, is actually increasing state spending to 32.4% from the previous year. And hopefully next year, and that's always the case, he's always going to tell us next year I will spend less. Not this year, but next year. And you can see his estimates for next year is going down in terms of expenditure as a percentage of GDP. The fiscal deficit is set at 4.6% of GDP in the current financial year, which will end the end of March. He sets the fiscal deficit is set at 5% of GDP. The coming financial year, which starts on the 1st of April, Minister of Finance estimates a fiscal deficit of 4.6%. It is likely to be more than that. But again, in coming years, the fiscal deficit will keep on falling. And then the estimates are for GDP is at the bottom line there. So if we look at these numbers, I think the minister is too optimistic on revenue. He's too optimistic on expenditure. And I think the fiscal deficit is likely to be bigger than what the Minister of Finance is predicting there. Now, putting this whole presentation together was extremely difficult. And there are many mistakes in the documents of the Minister of Finance. One, I guess, could have expected that because the budget was, they had to redo the whole thing in a matter of 3 weeks. And this is one example of where the Minister of Finance is making, where the documents are simply wrong. Like, for example, the GDP numbers for 2024 was 0.6% and not 0.8%. That 0.8% was a previous number, medium-term budget policy statement of the Minister of Finance, which, of course, but the point is that the numbers are wrong. Very difficult to get all the information, to get proper comparisons over time, because the information is just not there. And in many instances, the estimates are just wrong, or the numbers are just wrong. So the Minister of Finance tells us that last year the economy expanded to 0.8%, which is wrong. The actual number is 0.6%. This year, the Minister of Finance for 2025 tells us economic growth is going to be 1.9%, Well, that's his estimate. I disagree with that estimate. I don't think we're going to see 1.9%. I don't think we're going to see 1.5%. In fact, the IMF also expects less than 1.5%. So I don't think we're going to see 1.9%. And that will have an impact on all sort of other aggregates. It will have an impact on the ratios, the deficit to GDP ratios, for example, or revenue and expenditure to GDP ratios, to total revenue. If the economy is not growing, then the revenue will not materialize either. So yeah, making it very difficult for us to really put this presentation together because some of the numbers are simply wrong. This is economic growth. Now you can see what's been happening to economic growth the last couple of years. Last year, 0.6%. Now the Minister of Finance tells us 1.9%. And even the years thereafter, but even if we do get to 1.9%, my goodness, our own Minister of Finance doesn't see economic growth. That is slightly better than population growth. So our own Minister of Finance does not have confidence in the South African economy, predicting 1.9% for next year, which I doubt is going to be realized. The revenue numbers, this is, I told you that the tax base in South Africa is very, very narrow. And just to prove that to you, this is personal income taxes, for example. On the left-hand side, you have the number of personal income tax pays. On the right-hand side, you have how much is paid by the various personal income tax payers. On the right-hand side, the top part, that yellowish, goldish kind of color there, that's a third of total personal income taxes, which is the most important revenue source to the Minister of Finance. And just over 200,000 individuals pay a third, 200,000 individuals pay a third of total personal income taxes. 3.4 million taxpayers out of a population of 65 million pays 90% of total personal income taxes. So, but the biggest chunk of personal income taxes are paid by a very, very small, tiny minority. And again, a third of personal income taxes is paid by just over 200,000 individuals in the country. This is the same for companies. And in the case of companies, 1,000 companies pay more than 70% of total company taxes. This just goes to show, let me go back to individuals. If we increase personal income taxes, you're going to get less money because we are over that so-called Laffer curve. The same goes for companies to a large extent. We can't increase company taxes because our company tax rates are far too high. And companies are going to leave. And they're not going to do business in this country because they pay too much taxes. We need to reduce this. Some announcements. The minister announced a 1 percentage point increase in VAT, 0.5% this year and 0.5% next year. And that's going to give him 28 billion, or that's what he says. I disagree with that. I don't think in his calculations, he included the second round effects properly. I can't see him getting 28 billion. I think he will be lucky if he gets 20 billion extra from this full 1% increase, 0.5% this year and 0.5% next year. In fact, this year, I don't think he's going to get a full percent of. He says he's going to get 13.5% for the 0.5% increase this year. I don't think so. I think it's probably going to be about 10 billion or so, and not 13.5 billion as what the Minister of Finance expects. Then there was a significant increase in personal income taxes of about 28 billion rand over 3 years. For this coming year, personal income tax increased by 18 billion rand. Now, what I mean by that, there was no percentage increase on personal income taxes, but there was no adjustment for the effect of inflation. This is so-called bracket creep. And there was, in fact, then, if you calculate the actual increase in personal income taxes, there's an increase of 18 billion rand in personal income taxes. So the increase in personal income taxes, because the Minister of Finance did not adjust for bracket creep, is actually more than what he expects to get by way of an increase in value-added taxes. Let that sink in for a moment. So personal income taxes, we are over the Laffer curve. He says he's going to get an extra 18 billion because he did not adjust for inflation. I disagree with that because we are over the Laffer curve. We're probably going to get in less than that. And the same goes for value-added tax. I've mentioned that already. There was no increase in the fuel levy. which is that's something that typically would have put a significant upward pressure on inflation. And I guess that's part of the reason why the minister did not increase that. The excise duties, or the so-called sin taxes, increased by about 7%, close to 7%. And that's more than the inflation rate. But this is really getting dangerous because already we have a major problem with tobacco, illegal cigarettes, because it's so much cheaper. If you can buy cigarettes so much cheaper on the black market, and the same is happening with alcohol. The alcohol, more and more black market alcohol becomes available. It is much, much cheaper because of this massive taxes on alcohol that we have in South Africa. And we shouldn't be increasing the excise duties on these products by this much, because simply what you are doing, you're forcing people to start and buy in the black market, where taxes are, of course, not applicable, and where these products are significantly cheaper. We are basically forcing people to buy illegal stuff because the legal stuff is getting far too expensive. This is just a composition of where the revenue is coming from. 37% personal income taxes, followed by value-added tax, that is 22% of total contribution, and then corporate tax is about 15% of total contribution of the total revenue of the Minister of Finance. On the expenditure side, this is where the money goes to. This year, the first time in history, debt service cost will chew up 18% of total state expenditure. The first one, the biggest one, is 20% goes to education, followed by debt service costs, 425 billion rand going to that. And in the third place now is social expenditure. Last year, social expenditure was actually bigger than debt service cost. This year, the first time in history, debt service cost or interest on state debt is the second most important expense item of the Minister of Finance. And if we continue on this trajectory, debt service cost interest will be bigger than education even within a matter of about 2 or 3 years if we do not cut back on state spending in total and stop borrowing the way we have been for many, many years. So, yeah, this is something to be concerned about. We pay more on interest than on social protection in South Africa. The Minister of Finance tells us, now this graph, the bottom one is just how many people are employed. That's that blue line. The orange line are how many people are getting grants in South Africa. This excludes the civil servants, because there are civil servants in South Africa, or in many cases just glorified grant recipients. But there are 28 million people receiving grants today in South Africa. And the Minister of Finance told us that this is the last year of the so-called COVID grant, and in a year's time, the COVID grant will come to an end. And that's the reason why that orange line falls like that. I don't think that is going to happen. There's nothing as permanent as a temporary state expenditure. And once you start giving people money, there's no way you can stop doing that. This COVID grant will remain, maybe in another form, but it will not come to an end. And that green line, the dotted line, is just a ratio. So currently, we have approximately 1.7 people getting a grant from the state for every one person with actually a job in the economy. Just goes to show the massive, massive dependency on the state. Now, the grant recipients will get 5% more. That is less than the previous budget 3 weeks ago. So grant recipients, because their VAT was not increased by 2%, the Minister of Finance now says that I can't give the grant recipients anything more but 5%, so they're getting 5%. But the civil servants, they can still get their 5.5%. And in most cases, they're overpaid. In most cases, they're underworked. I think this is just unfair to give our grant recipients less than, because they are really struggling to survive. While the civil servants, they like I've said, they are very, very well remunerated in South Africa, and they get above inflation increase of 5.5% now. And the Minister of Finance is telling the opposition parties that we are not giving the civil servants a bigger increase because you guys did not allow me to increase VAT even more. Well, that is wrong, Minister of Finance, because all the money goes into one pot, and you cannot link grant recipients or the grants expenditure to, for example, VAT, because it all comes out of one pot. And the same goes. So the Minister of Finance decided to give the civil servants another above inflation increase of 5.5%, but he gave the grant recipients an increase of only 5%. And then he says, at the end of March next year, this COVID grant will come to an end. No way. There's no way that is going to happen. A couple of other expenditure items. So less for Eskom. Now, this is a clever trick of the Minister of Finance. What he did, he said, listen, I'm not going to give Eskom this grants that I previously promised. But in the meantime, Eskom is making losses in excess of 20 billion rand annually as well. I think the minister is trying to pull the wool over our eyes here, because Eskom will eventually come back and say, listen, I want that money back in any event. But so he's going to transfer 20 billion less to Eskom this year and next year as well. And like I've said, that eventually Eskom will come back because they're making losses in excess of 20 billion every year. Transport or Transnet is supposed to get about 400 billion extra over 3 years, which is a good thing. Hopefully, a lot of that money will go to the harbors and go with the railroads as well. Sanral apparently will spend approximately 100 billion more over the next 3 years. That's included in that 400 billion, just by the way. Civil servants, I mentioned that. So the civil servants get 7.3 billion rand more than what they were supposed to be getting. Remember, the medium-term budget policy statement last year, the Minister of Finance penciled in a certain amount of money that the civil servants are supposed to be getting. He increased that now by 7.3 billion rand. NHI gets 10 billion rand. I put that in inverted commas because that's not only NHI, it's to change some of these electronic systems as well. So it goes under the NHI, but it's not really NHI. In fact, the NHI didn't really get much. The NHI is not going to be realized because we just do not have money. SARS is getting 4 billion rand extra over the next 3 years so they can squeeze us even more. Now, I believe everybody should pay their dues in taxes. Unfortunately, the more efficient SARS is, the more money they take out of taxpayers' pockets, and they take it from the productive side of the economy and give it to the unproductive side of the economy, which is the state. So I actually do not want SARS to be very efficient. What we need to do is lower taxes. If you want everybody to pay their taxes, lower the tax burden people will, and of course improve the efficiency of the state. People do not want to pay taxes because they think their money is wasted, and because of the very high tax rates that we pay in South Africa. Do that, fix that, and people will be happier to pay those taxes. Blue light brigades, they still going to get the 2 billion. Come on, my goodness gracious. The only safe people in this country are the politicians with the blue light brigades. 11.6 billion will be given for land claims. That's actually quite interesting. I think part of the reason for that is that they want to accelerate this the land redistribution process that has been lagging for many, many years because of mismanagement and corruption and so on. They want to accelerate that. And maybe that is a sort of a way of telling the rest of the world that expropriation without compensation is not going to happen. Well, the only way I really will believe that if they remove that from the statutory books completely. And then the minister also said there will be reviews of future spending, but they've been saying that forever, that they will review future spending. Just a couple of other numbers that are important. We are running a primary budget surplus, which is a good thing, by the way, which means if you do not include interest payment, then there actually is a budget surplus, but it's still a deficit if you include interest payment, and interest payment is going up very rapidly, as I showed previously. The deficit is set at 4.6% of GDP. Again, I'm not so sure that will be achieved because I think the revenue is going to disappoint. The debt to GDP ratio now is set to stabilize within next year at 76.2%. But this is what happens every year. We will stabilize the debt to GDP ratio, but only next year, not yet. I just want to show you this. This is very important. The bottom, this is who holds South African domestic bonds. The bottom one, the blue one there, that is foreigners. How much foreigners hold South African domestic bonds or the debt instruments. And they are mostly Europeans and Americans. Let me repeat that. They're mostly Europeans and Americans. Now, Donald Trump, if he kicks us off AGOA, that's going to hurt. If he levies some sort of tariff against South Africa, that's going to hurt even more. But what's really going to hurt, if Donald Trump decides to impose some sort of financial sanction against South Africa, and he tells the asset managers and these pension funds that they are not allowed to buy South African domestic bonds, that blue part there, that is going to lead to where we were in the late 1980s. And that will lead to the South African economy going into a very deep and a very painful recession. That is a much more powerful instrument in the hands. That's a much bigger stick that Donald Trump can use than kicking us off AGOA, for example. This is again the same sort of numbers. You can go through this a little bit later if you want to. This is the Minister of Finance's debt to GDP outlook. He tells us, and every year he moves it out. He kicks the can down the road, and this is what he now says, in that the debt to GDP ratio in a year's time will stabilize at 76.2%, and then it will come down. Next year, we will see the same graph, but only 1 year out. And this time next year, it will be higher, 76.3 or 76.4% or 77% of GDP or whatever the case might be, if we continue on the same trajectory on which we have been for the past 15 years or even longer. Interest payments, 425 billion, as I've mentioned. This is something we had to do something. And this is an interesting calculation that Francois did just now. So every individual in South Africa, each one of you, owe nearly 100 billion rand, rather 100,000 rand more than what you think you owe, because that is the per capita debt in South Africa. The interest payment in South Africa on that massive debt, the interest payment is equal to 13,500 rand per second. Per second. 13,500 rand per second that the Minister of Finance pays on interest on this massive state debt that was accumulated by this government, or mostly by this government. There has been talk recently of improvement of our ratings. There could be a bit of an improvement, but we are still junk. So I don't think the ratings will be improved. It really depends on whether the rating agencies will believe this budget and whether the debt will stabilize and actually come down. I don't think that is actually going to happen. But there are some other stuff that we can do to improve the rating agencies or the ratings. One thing is impose the Zondo Commission, or rather implement the Zondo Commission, and put a couple of guys in orange overalls, politicians preferably, and that could get us off the grey list very quickly, and that can actually contribute to a slight improvement in South Africa's rating as well. But I don't think that is going to happen. The state is a massive destroyer of capital. They destroy approximately 200 billion rand annually, which basically means they'll borrow long-term money and spend it on short-term current expenditure, which is the same as destroying capital, by the way. So that's the amount of money, about 200 billion annually. The minister said, I mentioned this already, he will stabilize debt. The deficit, I've mentioned that already. And the debt of the state excludes that about 800 billion debt of guarantees. And not only the guarantees, there are some other debt that is not guaranteed, like, for example, the local authorities and some of the state-owned enterprises as well. And if you really consolidate all the debt of the Minister of Finance, his own debt, as well as the debt that he will eventually have to take over, the actual debt to GDP ratio in South Africa is about 95% of GDP. Okay, some final impressions. Kusatu, extreme disappointment. That's what they said, Kusatu. Now, that's important because Kusatu is a very important member of the Tripartite Alliance. The South African Communist Party, by the way, already indicated that they're going to go it alone at next year's local elections. Let's see if they're going to actually do that. Municipalities, that 109 billion that municipalities owe to Eskom, that's not included in the minister's estimates. VAT means high inflation means higher interest rates, and it's a regressive tax. Expenditure to grow by 5.6% this year, compared to the budget 3 weeks ago when expenditure was growing at 5.8%. Now, the important point here is, if you want to get politicians to spend less money, you must make sure they have less money to spend. And that's exactly what is happening now. Despite the fact that we're running out of money, the Minister of Finance is still increasing expenditure by 5.6%. But now that he really came under pressure the last 2-3 weeks to make a plan about state expenditure, now he's actually cutting back on state expenditure. That's the point. So if you really want to get politicians to spend less, don't give them money to spend. And then they will be forced to spend less money. The state is too big in South Africa. And here's an excellent example. 3 weeks ago, he was planning to increase state expenditure by 5.8%. Now it's 5.6% because there's no more money to spend. Keep the pressure on. That's what I say. I mentioned SARS already. There's a vague commitment about future spending reviews. Let's see if that is going to realize. But they will be forced to cut back on state expenditure, and it's high time. The state is too big, too inefficient, too corrupt. And I would say this budget is a pathetic attempt to halt the fiscal slide. We are still on the slippery slope. The market's reaction was a little bit negative. I think most of this was already in the market, and I've never seen a budget with so much leaks before the budget. I mean, just everything was out before the time, and but it's no, it's a lot of fun. This is my 40th budget, and the part that I really enjoy is to see how the politicians are jumping around like a bunch of cats on a hot tin roof, trying to square the circle. But eventually they will be forced to cut back on state expenditure and improve state efficiency and cut back on the blue light brigades. That will be a nice symbolic reduction in state expenditure. But no, this is the budget. This is how we see the budget. We've put a lot of work in here. But I've got a suspicion this budget is not going to be approved. The ANC's got 40% in parliament. They need another 10% to pull this over the line. The DA made it clear they're not going to support this. Will the EFF support a VAT increase? Will MK support a VAT increase? No, they made it very clear they won't. And from now on, the budget is going to be this big political play ball, and everybody's going to demand something. The EFF might decide to support, and the MK might decide to support a 0.5% increase in VAT, provided something else is also included in the budget, which will not be acceptable to the ANC, as an example. So I don't think this budget is going to be approved. This is very interesting. It's quite dangerous as well. But we've been warning about this. Economists have been warning about this. And now the day has come where we have to make a plan. We couldn't afford everything. We've been warning about this for years. We've been warning about these rising debt levels. We've been warning about the inefficiency and the corruption of the state. And now the time has come for the state to start really cutting back on state expenditure, because there is no alternative. The state is too big. We must spend less. And there's a long list of things where the state can spend much, much less on. And now the politicians will be forced to spend less. This was a lot of fun. Thank you very much for staying with me. I think this is just a graph on the valuation of the currency. We will send it to you. It will be on this QR code. So go take this QR code, take your phone, and you will get this presentation. It's not going to help you very much because, like I've said, I don't think this budget will be approved. I think there's a lot of fun waiting over the next couple of weeks and months in South Africa to see whether we're going to get the budget soon or not. And of course, that can be quite disruptive as well. But like I've said, we've been warning about this for a very, very long time already. Again, thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions, there's a Q&A at the bottom. Put the questions in here. And Francois has got a couple of questions already, I think, Francois.
Yes, many questions.
Okay, let's shoot it. Let's shoot, Francois. We've got about, say, 10, 15 minutes or so to see if we can answer some of the questions.
Increasing VAT is not a better option for South Africans, seeing as it punishes everybody.
Yes.
It might lead to voters changing their minds about the ANC instead of just punishing the rich and the middle class.
Yes, actually, I'm in favor of a VAT increase. I think VAT should be increased in South Africa. But, and this is a very important part, increase VAT without any zero-rated items. It's not a good idea if you want to help the poor. Rather do it in the expenditure side of the budget. But increase VAT and cut back on more damaging taxes. And a company tax, for example, is far more damaging than an increase in VAT. And remember, companies don't pay taxes. They shift the total tax burden down to individuals. So yes, you can increase tax, but not to increase spending. Increase tax to reduce some more damaging taxes like company taxes, as an example. If you use it for that purpose, then I'm very much in favor of a VAT increase, yes.
Did the minister prioritize local government in his budget? This is the coal face of our life.
Yes, there was more money to the local. Remember, they get a so-called equitable share, the local authorities. That is just over 10 billion, 110 billion, if I remember correctly. That will be transferred to the local authorities. But then there is a conditional grant going to the local authorities as well. They don't spend all of that money because they can't get to that. It's a conditional grant. They're only allowed to spend it on certain things, for example. And the local authorities can't spend all of that. But they have been, remember, the local authorities are supposed to be able to wash their own faces. They're supposed to get sufficient income from their own revenue sources, a local property taxes as an example. But the local authorities are pathetic in the way they manage that. Their collections are horrible. Their service delivery, more than 70% of them has got qualified audits and so on. It's a management problem at the local authority. The same goes for government, generally speaking. It's a political problem and it's a management problem. It's a skills problem. It is not a money problem.
A lot of people are asking what happens if the budget is rejected, and what are the risks involved?
Okay, now I'm not a legal expert here, but this is uncharted territory. I've never been here. Like I've said, I've analyzed 40 budget. So if the budget is rejected in 2 or 3 weeks' time, they will start debating this probably a bit sooner in Parliament. And I think it's going to be rejected, the budget as is, which then means that we do not have a budget. But we have a budget because a year ago, a budget was approved. And that budget is still in play, still in force. And according to the Constitution, the way I understand it, you can keep on spending up to 40% or just over 40% of last year's budget before you really run out of money. So we've got a couple of months actually to get the budget together and actually get a new budget. But there's going to be plenty of horse trading in the meantime from the various political parties. I think eventually the DA will eventually support the ANC, but then the ANC must cut back on that VAT increase, and that means that the ANC is going to sit with a lot of egg on their faces. But for the next couple of months, it will be business as usual, but I've got a suspicion it will be a lot of fun to watch and see what's going to happen in Parliament.
Two questions seem to come together. Do you think our population is gearing up or making ready for an Arab Spring?
Yeah. Is our population getting ready? The people are getting, yes, restless. People are getting restless. I can give you the numbers on unemployment and poverty in South Africa. I don't think an Arab Spring kind of thing. No. We have a well-functioning democracy. I think at the current trajectory, the ANC is likely to lose big time, continue to lose big time. We will see a new political landscape in South Africa. Let's see what's going to happen to the local authority elections next year. People, the majority of many people that support the ANC simply can't get themselves to vote for another political party. So they're simply going to stay at home. But according to most recent research by Frans Cronje, for example, the ANC support will fall to 32% if there's a general election tomorrow. And I think that the slip of the ANC will continue. But clearly, there's a need for a political party. The DA could become that. The DA is not that yet. But we need another political grouping, maybe the good guys in the ANC, and there are not many, and maybe the good guys in the DA can come together and form a new political kind of formation slightly to the right of the ANC, because that's actually what we need in South Africa. But I don't think we're talking about an Arab Spring in a country, no.
Many people asking about a tax revolt and the likeliness of something like that.
A tax revolt, that's an interesting one. Again, in fact, we've had tax revolts in South Africa. And you see, if you listen to the SARS, for example, they're talking about hundreds of billions of rands of money that is owed to SARS. And the reason why is because two reasons. Because tax rates are too high and because people see a lot of our money is being wasted. Those are the two reasons. I've mentioned that already. So in a way, we already have a tax revolt. But South Africa's tax regime is highly sophisticated. And I've done some numbers and I've forgotten exactly what the bottom line was, but it comes down to the following. Remember, a few financial directors of the big companies in South Africa pay just about all the taxes. Think about that. Your personal income taxes are deducted by a company and they are paid over to SARS by your financial director. And the big companies pay, like I've showed earlier, they pay just about all the personal income taxes, and they administer the personal income taxes, and they pay the company taxes as well. But they are also the big VAT collectors. So there are a relatively small number of individuals in South Africa that physically and practically transfer most of these taxes to SARS. And they are the financial directors of the big companies in South Africa. And those guys are not going to stop paying taxes. They are just too scared to end up in jail. And they are very well, I guess they are, with the big companies in South Africa, are very well managed. And the tax regime in South Africa is such that it's very difficult to really evade taxes. So no, a tax revolt, yes. The smaller taxes, we can see that already. The toll roads is a good example. People trying to evade taxes, people very aggressively trying to set their tax affairs, for example. But those big financial directors that are responsible for just about all the transfers to SARS, or a big chunk of transfers to SARS, I guess they will be too scared to end up in jail. So no major tax revolt now.
There's a couple of questions that seem to lean towards the taxes on companies. And shouldn't we, like the US, reduce these taxes and then use that to help boost economic growth?
Yeah, without a doubt. There's one tax that I will without a doubt reduce, and that is company taxes. We must cut back on a company tax. South Africa's company taxes at 27%. It's much higher than our peers. Globally, company taxes are coming down, and we have to aim for about 15%. That's what we need to aim for. So yes, company taxes must be reduced. Not only company taxes, personal income taxes as well. We're losing our rich people. And they are the big taxpayers. They are immigrating. They don't see a financial future here. They are overtaxed. So we need to reduce personal income taxes at the top end. We need to cut back on that as well. But company taxes, without a doubt, is a first tax that must be reduced. Yes.
Are we at a place that we have to take all our money offshore? All our money?
All our money offshore? No. No, you live in South Africa, you want to stay in South Africa. Let me give you a couple of places that should give you a relatively good return in terms of investments. The local equity market is actually still quite cheap. And the local equity market, the bulk of the profits of the listed equity market, they earn their income abroad. So it's actually international companies that you're buying, and they're cheap. Local equity market is a good place to put your money. Despite what's going on in the economy, the bond market is also giving you very good returns, especially if you've got a smallish amount of money, 1 or 2 million rand, you don't want to take any risk, then you can get a return in excess of 10%, which is pretty much guaranteed. If you live in South Africa and you get pretty much a guaranteed income in excess of 10%, that's not a bad return. And also for foreigners, the local bond market is a very attractive market. You buy a very cheap currency, you buy very high yields in a very liquid market. And you can very quickly run away if something goes bad. So for foreigners, the local bond market is very attractive. International markets, the American equity market, I won't touch those. They are just too expensive. But you can go into the second tier companies in the US. Depending on what you think is going to happen to inflation in the US, whether you should buy US bonds or not. If they are going into a recession, then of course you have to buy US bonds. But from now, I'm not so sure there's a recession on its way in the US. European equities, yes, you can buy those, especially the ones that do business with America. And I especially like Japanese equities. So because they're relatively cheap as well. So yeah, Japanese equities you can buy as well. So there are a couple of places where I think you can potentially put your money.
This is a good one. Thanks, Audrey. Do we want to create more jobs in the informal sector, or how do we create more jobs?
How do we create? There's only one way of creating more jobs. Actually, I'm very much against job creation as an objective. There's only one thing that matters, and that's economic growth, and jobs will happen. So that's the only way to grow the economy. But talking about the informal sector, we have these massive levels of poverty and unemployment. And what I'm particularly concerned about, some research suggests that up to 25% of our children go to bed hungry. That is real poverty. That's absolute poverty. That is really bad. We must grow the economy. But having said that, despite the high levels of unemployment, actually, the real poverty level in South Africa is actually not as bad as one would have expected. And the reason why I say that is because I think that the informal sector in South Africa is probably bigger than what we think it is. I know the rule of thumb is that the informal sector is about 10% of the economy. I think it could be much bigger. And that also means that the South African economy is probably bigger than what we think it is, which then means that these ratios like debt and deficit and also are not as bad as we think it is. But that's a number that we perhaps need to do a little bit more research on.
Interest rates, are you happy at the levels they are now?
I'm happy with interest rates where they are at the moment. The real interest rates are actually quite high at the moment. But remember, you can't just look at the snapshot of interest rates, see interest rates is there and inflation is there and interest rates are there and the gap is because it's more you have to look at it over time and you also have to look at other variables like, for example, inflation expectations, which is still relatively high. It is coming down. But I'm very happy with interest rates where they are at the moment. Lesotho Kanyako is doing an excellent job, but I do believe there is room for him to cut at least by another 25 bips. But he's on the conservative side. The Minister of Finance didn't make any announcements on inflation. I actually hoped for a reduction in inflation targets. He did not do that. For now, we've got the Reserve Bank is targeting 4.5%, and I think they're going to get to 4.5% or just below that for the next, say, year or so, which then means that there is a possibility or room for another 25 bips reduction. So yes, I'm relatively happy with the interest rates where they are.
And if Trump cancels AGOA, what's the implication for jobs and for personal income tax?
Yeah, if Trump cancels AGOA, it's not the end of the world. AGOA is probably going to shave off 0.2% of economic growth. But in an environment where the economy is hardly growing, 0.2% is a lot. What does that mean for personal income taxes? Well, that means weaker economic growth. The weaker economic growth means all taxes will be under pressure, not only personal income taxes. And it probably means that more people will emigrate. Those high income earners are likely to emigrate if there is some sort of conflict with Trump. If it becomes clear that the relationship between South Africa and the United States is getting deteriorates, I suspect more people will immigrate, and that will have a negative impact on personal income tax collections.
How do we grow the economy? A lot of people want to know.
3 things you need to do, and I can expand on that as well. I won't do it now, but you grow the economy by doing 3 things. You protect private property rights, the broad definition of private property rights. You protect private property rights. You encourage and you protect the free trade in your economy. Repeat that. You encourage and you protect free trade in your economy. And the third one is you make sure you have sound money, low inflation. Those 3 things. Protect private property rights, encourage and protect free trade, low inflation. And I guarantee you, your economy will grow. Look at what we have. We've got expropriation without compensation. We've got, for example, minimum wages, discouraging, making it illegal to trade freely between individuals. And the inflation that we do have is mostly because of administrative prices, municipality putting up their taxes or Eskom putting up their prices and stuff like that. That's so-called administrative prices. So I'm afraid those 3 things we're not doing very well when it comes to those important ingredients which will guarantee economic growth. Let me repeat that. Protect private property rights, free trade, sound money. Do that and your economy will grow.
I like this question because it always gets asked. If you were the Minister of Finance, Dawie, what would you do differently?
It's not good enough. No, don't make me the Minister of Finance. You must make me the president, or not even that. You must make me a dictator. Well, let's be honest about a few things. The one is that we cannot not spend money on social expenditure. We cannot allow our fellow South Africans to die. There are many millions of people, 18 million people getting a grant from the state. We can't just stop that. Certainly will not stop that. But what I will do, I will cut back on a wage bill that is far too high. I will start privatizing as much as I possibly can. Transnet, Eskom and the like. I will close a lot of state departments, Department of Small Business Development, I will close that. That's a wastage of money. I will fire half the ministers. That's the kind of stuff that we must cut back on state expenditure. And as far as taxes are concerned, I will completely overhaul the tax system, the tax regime. I will make it dramatically cheaper and much less complicated. The South African tax system is highly complicated. We've got more than 100 taxes, just by the way. So I will reduce the number of tax brackets, for example. I will I will simplify this whole thing quite dramatically. And very importantly, I will get rid of foreign exchange regulations. What a horrible, horrible thing. And I will lower the tax, or rather the inflation target, initially to 3% and eventually to 2%. There are a couple of things that it will do. But in order to do that, maybe it will be better if I'm the dictator, not even the president.
What happens after Trump? Is it something that we should be concerned about because his term is only for a couple of years?
Yeah.
And then just a follow-up question, are we in favor of the Trump and Musk marriage?
Okay, what is happening with Trump? And this is long overdue. Long overdue. If you look at the size of states and governments, not only in South Africa, but globally, governments and states have become just too big. Politicians are in control about everything. They are just wanting to do more and more and more. And in the process, they keep on increasing taxes and they keep on increasing debt even. So it's overdue. Xavier Milei, for example, in South America, he's an example of a country. Argentina is an example of a country that simply cannot afford this massive state machinery anymore. And he's cutting back on the size of the state. And it's happening all over the world, and including Trump and Musk. Now, you might not like Trump and you might not like Musk. The reality is, perhaps they're doing it in a not in a very elegant manner, but the reality is the US government is too big. They owe too much money. And the same goes for just about all countries in the world. So even after Musk and Trump, this trend will continue where we cut back on the size of the state because the world economy, and certainly the South African economy, cannot carry this massive burden of this huge state and this huge state debt anymore. If we don't do that, we are all going to get into a big trouble. Perhaps South Africa will end up there long before the Americans.
Is it true that the taxi industry is not being taxed? The businesses as well as the individuals working in the industry?
That is not completely true. The taxi industry is being taxed or supposed to be taxed. Some of them do pay their income taxes, for example, but they are being taxed indirectly through the fuel tax, as an example, the fuel levy. And that's another tax that I would actually increase. I would increase the fuel levy and it will reduce some other taxes, the ones that I've mentioned previously. But what is generally true about the taxi industry, I understand the taxi industry is worth about 100 billion rand or so. What is generally true is that they are not contributing their fair share to the tax, to SARS. But again, having said that, would I like them to contribute more to SARS? Because if they contribute their fair share to SARS like all of us, then money, a taxi driver that evades tax, that tax in his own pocket is worth much more to the economy than the same tax in the pocket of SARS or the Minister of Finance. So yes, we should all pay our taxes, but the problem is that the tax rates are too high in South Africa and the state's efficiency is not good enough. But you're right, the taxi industry is not paying the same amount of money that they should be paying.
There's a couple of good questions from Stuart as well. I think I'll just touch on the one. We do all this state support, and he specifically mentions the grants, 28 million people receiving grants. Why is the Gini coefficient, as an example, not coming down?
Yeah, why is the Gini coefficient not coming down? Well, if we stop paying the grants to 28 million people and start paying them zero, argument's sake, then the Gini coefficient indeed will go up. So it will worsen. The Gini coefficient will indeed worsen in South Africa. But the reason why we have a Gini coefficient where we have a fairly high Gini coefficient in South Africa, let me just explain what it is. The Gini coefficient looks at the distribution of various things. And we talk about the Gini coefficient that usually meant the distribution of income in South Africa. And we've got a very skewed Gini coefficient in South Africa, whereby few people get about everything or a lot, and a lot of people get very little. And that's the part of the state in South Africa takes from that rich people and give it to the poor people, reducing the inefficiency, or rather reducing the effect of a Gini coefficient a little bit. But if you really want to make a dramatic change to the Gini coefficient, many people would say, if you take all the rich people's money, this is a theoretic experiment, take all the rich people money and give it to the poor people only, then you will have a dramatic impact on the Gini coefficient. Unfortunately, no. The only way we can have a dramatic impact on the Gini coefficient is if we can start getting poor people a little bit up, or put differently, middle income people a little bit lower in terms of income. And that's where the big gap is. The big gap is in the middle. It's not on the extremes. And in fact, if you look at various population groups in South Africa, the Gini coefficient amongst blacks in South Africa is much higher than the Gini coefficient amongst whites in South Africa. And what is also clear, as economies start growing faster and better and become wealthier, the Gini coefficient comes down as well. In poor countries, the Gini coefficient is usually much higher than in rich countries.
Nice. I think we're almost to a lot of people just saying thank you. And then a question about the zero rate basket.
Can we do that? The last one.
Yeah, great.
Okay, there's the zero rated basket was expanded a little bit. VAT items zero rated in a VAT basket. That's a wrong thing. I did mention it earlier. I wouldn't zero rate anything in South Africa. The moment you do that, you create the opportunity for fraud and all sort of things. And it is also distortive to relative prices in the economy. And in any event, the benefit of that doesn't go to the poor. There's a lot of research being done on this, in that it's all you do if you zero rate some stuff is that you simply increase the profit margins of the wholesalers and the retailers. It doesn't work. If you really want to help the poor, what you need to do it on an expenditure side. So rather increase grants and leave nothing to be zero rated with the exception of exports. Okay, well, that's it. Thank you very much again for listening to me. This is I'm Dawie Roodt. I'm the economist at the Efficient Group. This is the QR code. Take your phone, take a picture of this QR code. And if you want to send me an email or anybody at Efficient, we will try to answer those emails. And this was a lot of fun to analyze the budget. And thank you very much for everybody for all the questions.